Amitav Acharya. And without any ado, will you please join me in congratulating him on this fine book? Amitav is writing these books faster than we can read them, actually. When we were planning this event, he said, he called and he spoke with Aurora and he says, I just have another one coming out a couple of weeks after this one, but so we will be busy. I actually just bought the book up front there, and I intend to read it and give him some feedback and discuss it in CRS. Speaking of CRS, we have a new CRS Students Association, and I'm delighted to see so many of our students here. And we have in our midst the president of the CRS Students Association, Amy Osberghaus. Would you, Amy, please stand up and introduce yourself? And what are you planning?
Yeah, we actually have some new events coming out within the next couple of weeks. So it's going to be sent out to all. Well, we have some other events too that'll be for SIS at large. So those will be open.
Okay. So what she didn't want to say quite yet, but I know it's been confirmed, is that the United States Ambassador to Thailand has agreed to come at the invitation of CRS Student Association to meet with us. Great. So we have great things planned. I know Amitav will not miss that event. Okay, so listen, we're really delighted to do this. We're delighted that Dean, as always, will join us and make some remarks. And I want to take this opportunity to welcome you all here. We sent out a call for a co-sponsor, and the person closest to my office is my illustrious colleague, Mike Schroeder from the opposite end, who's the chair of GGPS. And I now call on Mike to make some remarks. Thank you, and we look forward, of course, to hearing the main speakers. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much. It was a real pleasure to be asked for GGPS to be able to co-sponsor this work. And personally, I was going to say, I've actually, Global Governance, Politics, and Security Program, in case you don't know what GGPS means. We're just sort of thrilled because Amitav's been a pillar of our research community, one of the more widely sought after teachers in the classroom at the master's level, and seeing some of his students here from last term who are also members of the Global Politics Student Association, who apparently the bar has been raised on them with the ambassador coming. So good luck, guys. I was actually first introduced to Amitav's work when I was actually a master's student, a first-year master's student at University of British Columbia, which prides itself on being a school trying to engage in Asia-Pacific scholarship. And Amitav's work was assigned to us primarily to help us dispel the notion that just because Southeast Asia didn't have institutions that looked like the ones we had seen in Asia and in the West, didn't mean that there wasn't a sort of rich institutional architecture that was capable of really shaping the decisions of the states and the relations amongst them. That was about a decade ago. I've actually written on my paper to sigh now, but I won't do that. It was supposed to be a joke. That didn't go well. Today, I really don't think that partially as a result, and largely as a result of work like Amitav's, there's widespread recognition that regional institutions are really playing a central role in global governance and that are going to be necessary to sort of address a host of problems facing this world. But this particular book, and I had the pleasure of reading it last night, at least the first 3 chapters of it, I think does a much bigger service to his academic record and to the study of global governance by suggesting that governance requires paying much closer attention to regional identity formation. He's talked about it before in his other books, but I think he really takes it to the next level in this one. And then to really focus on the process of involving complex interactions between political forces, strategic elites, and the institutional setting. Again, we are just thrilled that you managed to publish this and that Randy invited us to be a part of this in CRS. And so at GGPS, I would say thank you and welcome to everyone else. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm grateful to both Randy and Mike for putting this event together and to the folks that work with them in both the Comparative and Regional Studies program and the Global Governance, Politics, and Security program. It's always a great moment when a faculty member produces a book. This particular one, as you've heard, produces them a lot, which is great. We want to do whatever we can to keep them going. And also really delighted that one of our visiting scholars visiting here from the London School of Economics, Dr. Jürgen Hake, is here to make some introductory remarks before Amitav discusses his book, and Pekun Heng, who's director of the ASEAN Studies Center, is here to make some remarks at the end, which I greatly appreciate. I do want to introduce Dr. Hake, who's an assistant professor of international relations at the London School of Economics. He's in the Asia Research Center at LSE, and his research interest and expertise relate to three areas in particular: security and international politics of Southeast Asia, regional organizations and arrangements in the Asia Pacific, especially ASEAN, the ASEAN Regional Forum, and the politics and foreign relations of Burma and Myanmar. And he has a number of publications, including 2 books with Routledge, the most recent of which is Myanmar's Foreign Policy, Domestic Influences, and International Implications. And after he speaks, as I mentioned, Professor Acharya will speak, the UNESCO Chair in Transnational Challenges and Governance, and Chair of the ASEAN Studies Center. So he and Professor Heng jointly work to run our ASEAN Studies Center, which has provided numerous activities and opportunities for the school in recent years, bringing together scholars, diplomats, and others working on the ASEAN region for a variety of fora. Before coming to AU, I'm not going to mention all these places. He was at a bunch of other places. Now, I do want to tell, I'm going to tell you a little story, though. I got to tell you this story because, as you've heard, I mean, he really is one of the most distinguished scholars in the field of international relations, and he is, in fact, the incoming president of the International Studies Association, and we're greatly looking forward to celebrating that at the presidential reception at ISA in Toronto in March. I would say it wasn't that long before I got involved in the process here to interview and then be selected as dean that I met Amitav on a train, either going or coming from Princeton. We were at a conference together at Princeton. And, I never want to miss an opportunity when I'm talking to someone of this caliber. So I said to Amitav, hey, we're doing this faculty search at GW, and maybe you should think about putting your name in for this search. It'd be great to have you under consideration. And he said to me, oh, I'm so happy at American University. I haven't been there very long, but I'm really happy at AU, and they're treating me so well. And no, I'm not interested in pursuing the opportunity at GW. All I can say is, thank goodness I completely failed in my recruitment effort at my prior place of employment. And all I can say is I just hope that the happiness that you expressed on that train, either going or coming from Princeton, is that you still feel that same level of happiness here at AU, and that that's the message you're delivering to any of my colleagues at other universities. So with that, Jürgen, I turn the floor over to you, and congratulations again to Amitav.
Well, first of all, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Professor Goldgeier and the school, and of course also Professor Acharya, to give me the opportunity to be here today. I'm only here for about 4 weeks at the AU doing some of my own research on foreign policy entrepreneurs in relation to US-Burma policy, and I think it's actually one of the books that Professor Goldgeier wrote on the expansion of NATO that inspired me to zoom in on that particular concept of foreign policy entrepreneur. In any case, I just want to sort of make a few sort of remarks, introductory remarks, that is about Amitav's book, and also maybe say a word or two about the context in which I think it stands. I mean, first of all, I'd like to, however, say that in many cases, of course, the focus on Southeast Asia is not as popular, as it would be to focus on Northeast Asia. There are always people who talk about China. There are always people who talk about Sino-Japanese relations these days, or developments on the Korean Peninsula. But I'd just like to reiterate the point that Southeast Asia is actually not only extremely diverse, but is also really interesting to focus on at this particular point in time. Yeah, you have domestic turmoil in Thailand. Yeah, you have a very difficult transition to some form of democracy in Burma, Myanmar. You have ASEAN coming closer to the 2015 deadline, by which they are trying to have an ASEAN community in place of sorts anyway. And of course we hear a lot about conflict in the South China Sea, and therefore Southeast Asian state, with states that are claimants obviously to that. I think that Southeast Asia deserves more focus, has also been recognized by US foreign policymakers. I think part of the pivot to the Asia Pacific has in fact been the concentration on renewing US policy towards Southeast Asia, and that's both at the multilateral level but also at the bilateral level. And of course some people are already worrying that this may fade away a little as Kurt Campbell has been replaced and as Secretary Clinton is no longer there. But hopefully we will see more of it, and I think, as was mentioned, I think too, Burma was mentioned, I think, and also the pivot was mentioned in the State of the Union address. Yeah, so one can, of course, hope for the best. There are many of us who look at Southeast Asia in different ways, but what is interesting, I think, is that we don't always talk to one another. Yeah? So there are people maybe who we would call the country experts who've learned the language, and who zoom in on various things to do with their particular country focus. There are other ones who do comparative politics or comparative political economy. Yet others still would focus on history. Post-Cold War or Cold War history in particular. There's so many things, and as IR scholars, I think we tend to look very much at foreign security policy issues. We look at regional institutions and various frameworks and the international relations in and of the region. Of course, this is where Amitav Acharya comes in. Yeah? Whose home turf, I think, as we know, is the discipline of international relations. But what makes him outstanding is really the way that he connects with other disciplines. And I think you will see that if you read that book, it will stand out to you as to how deep that dialogue actually is that he has, let's say, with the historians who've looked at Southeast Asia as a region over time. What Amitav does in his book is, of course, that he focuses on regionalism and in particular the construction of regional identity. And in other words, I think much of the book is really about the role of agency rather than just structures. And I think this is important to point out, because Amitav is seen widely as a person who is a constructivist. And I think particularly in North America, you would have an association of constructivism with a kind of structural perspective. So Amitav is also a constructivist, but what he does very well, he actually not just looks at structures, which he acknowledges, but he focuses on the role of agency in the making and remaking of that region. And I think this is something that you will see not only in this particular book, The Making of Southeast Asia, it's also something that he has written about extensively in the past. As regards this particular book, it's the second edition of a book he published with, I think it was Oxford University Press, around the turn of the millennium, which was called The Quest for Identity. And I read it shortly after it appeared, and it was thoroughly interesting to me. But I also recall that it was a bold book when I read it, in the sense that he seemed to be arguing that somehow Southeast Asian states were almost bent on achieving some kind of collective regional identity. And of course it came after the Asian financial crisis. So at a very difficult point in the recent history of Southeast Asia, when a lot of states were in turmoil, and even intra-regional relations were to some extent in some jeopardy. As you will find very often, bold books generate controversy, and I think Amitav did just that. He inspired a lot of comments, focusing in on the argument that he made. And I think it is to his very great credit that he has taken it upon himself now again to bring up the second edition of this book, partly because he's able to actually establish connections between what he did then and then some of his later work in terms of his own theoretical thoughts and developments. And also because this edition offers a very fine replique to the first edition. It actually does it really well. So I think when you look, is this me?
Sorry,
I'm speaking for too long. The making of Southeast Asia, it really represents as such a fine companion to Amitav's other key book, which is widely used in undergraduate and postgraduate teaching, which is Constructing a Security Community in Southeast Asia. And that book, of course, focuses on the concept of security community and on the focuses also on the concept of regional order. And this one sort of stands alongside it very well because it focuses more on the notion of regional identity. This book here is conceptually sophisticated, it is theoretically significant, and it contains, for a reader like me, numerous little gems in terms of the various illustrations he uses and the arguments that he puts across. It provides a great summary of the existing literature on pre-colonial interpolity relations in Southeast Asia. It offers a concise and eminently interesting account of how the Cold War impacted on Southeast Asia's international relations. And the empirical scope of the book is really quite amazing because it extends the discussion from the pre-colonial days right up to the present with reference to a range even of non-state actors and their role in making the region. And I think that's really fascinating. I just want to point out to sort of a couple of themes that I got from reading the book. This may not necessarily be what he wanted me to get out of it, but at least I'm just want to sort of zoom in on perhaps 4 of those. The first one is to do with the relationship between nationalism and regionalism. And some of us may, of course, think that this is actually something that is incompatible, as to how would the two work together. But in his book, Amitav actually shows that needn't be the case, and then hopefully we'll be able to say something more about that. The second sort of theme that I think runs through this book is the one of autonomous regionalism. This emphasizes, as you would expect, the internal construction of the region, and as such is something that obviously links up with some of his previous work. And it's important because some regions may not be constructed from within, they may be constructed from without, but it's very clear here that this concept of autonomous regionalism deserves further scrutiny. Thirdly, I think what is also very powerful and in some ways links up to other books done by Michael Liefer, for example, is the relationship that Amitav explores between the nature of the political systems of states in Southeast Asia and the nature and purpose of regionalism. So he points, obviously out that in the early days of ASEAN, they perceived what I think he calls also the purpose of collective political defense, of elites against those who might not have thought that these elites, were ruling legitimately all the way. But then he also obviously zooms in on the more recent period, looking at the impact of the political changes that some of these Southeast Asian countries have experienced, such as Indonesia, and then actually also tells to some extent the story that exists between the democratization of key states and how that actually shapes a different form of regionalism. Fourthly, and this is linked to my third point, it's the elite versus participatory regionalism. Obviously, the first one is what we would usually associate with ASEAN. In the 1990s, the critics of ASEAN would say this is a club of dictators. But and I think some people would, however, still insist that to a great extent Southeast Asian regionalism is driven by elites. Amitav, in this book, obviously shows that that is not the whole story. And the participatory regionalism, which would make us focus on the important role of non-state actors, gets a lot of attention in there. Underlying all of these is obviously the notion of Southeast Asia as an imagined community, so the region, yeah, as an imagined community, and there he draws on Ben Anderson. So to assess the book's importance, and I hope I'm still have 1 or 2 minutes. This is one of the very best and carefully put arguments, in my view, that there is an evolving regional identity, yeah, in Southeast Asia. And I think it's an important point, again, to re-emphasize, because over the last couple of years, there have been quite a few writers and analysts who have argued precisely the opposite, yeah? That actually there's not a lot of we feeling, there's not a lot of regional consciousness, yeah? And I think the making of Southeast Asia provides very significant and powerful counterpoints, both in terms of how we are supposed to think about regional identity and the empirical record, yeah, which substantiates his argument. At the same time, I'd like to also re-emphasize, however, that Amitav is very clear that there's nothing theological, yeah, about the regionalism we see in Southeast Asia, and his account incorporates many of the challenges, yeah, and setbacks to regionalism that have occurred. And secondly, in terms of making perhaps this contribution about agency. Yeah, at a time when structural approaches are pretty much again in vogue, and our attention, because not least of the China, U.S. relationship and so on, we focus so much on great power relations. This book again points to the importance that when we look at sort of small or medium-sized states, such as the ASEAN states, we should really be looking as to how they're able to, despite all the pressures that they face from the outside, are able to shape their own particular foreign policy as well as the region which they inhabit. So in that sense, to finish off, I think the making of Southeast Asia just reinforces Amitav's standing as the leading constructivist scholar on Southeast Asia. So it's a great book. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to speak from the podium, lest I fall asleep. I just came back from Indonesia 4 days ago, and I'm still very jet lagged. But first of all, let me start by thanking the 2 programs that I'm associated with, the CRS and the GGPS, GGPS, for organizing this. But before the dean goes, I would like to express my sincere thanks to him. In fact, I do remember that train ride we took from Princeton to Washington, and I very clearly remember that we had the conversation. I came back that evening and talked to my wife, and I said, you know what, I just had a conversation with this professor at GW. My wife was new to Washington at that time, and she didn't really know very much about the differences between universities. And what do you think? And she said, first of all, but you can't move anymore. You have moved around too much. And also the university, American has been so good to you, and and we are happy and nice and well settled. Why do you want to go to the other part of the town? It's too much traffic. I think GW probably, they don't probably realize it, but saying that they're so close to the White House and the State Department is actually a downside to it. Just think of how long it will take, and the crowd in the metro, and they're not even close to the metro. But I must say that I did have second thoughts, and I also said, did I make a mistake? I should have just expressed some interest. But when Jim was actually hired as the dean, I said, good, I don't have to feel bad about it anymore because he is here. So, I mean, if he thought that American was not comparable to GW, why would he come here? Because he had a great job there. So, and since then, I've never regretted. It's been really a wonderful time. It's really like family to me and my wife, and Jim has done wonderful things and doing wonderful things. I particularly want to thank him for putting up the money for my presidential reception. So those of you who go to ISA will find that the SIS reception follows the presidential reception, which is both funded by SIS, of course. But the only difference is that the SIS reception, you will have free drinks. In my reception, drinks are limited. But it's one continuum. Maybe the first time this will happen in ISA. the president's reception and the school of the president, where the president belongs to, the other reception follows consecutively, and everybody has a good time. So thanks, Jim, for your leadership and your vision and for your support. I never had an idea that he had turned down. When I first came here, within 2 months, I asked for some money. You know, deans are basically rich and powerful people, so you go to them for money. So I wanted to organize a little conference in Canberra, and he found a way to support me, and he has always been consistently supportive, and that's the hallmark of a dean, so how to support especially people who have ideas and very active in scholarship that brings, I hope, credit to the university and the school. About this book, let me start with, you'll get a chance to read, but I'm just fascinated to see close to 30 people turning up on a Thursday afternoon to listen to a talk about Southeast Asia. As Jürgen said, Southeast Asia doesn't get a lot of attention. If this was a seminar on China or US-China relations, I'm sure you can expect there'll be no shortage of people coming. Southeast Asia doesn't get that attention, although that's changing in this town because of the US government's policy since Obama came into office, the work we have done in the ASEAN Center, but it's also good to see many of you here. Some of my students are here, very happy to see that. I'm very grateful for Jürgen, who is spending a month of he's writing a book on Burma, US-Burma relations. And we have given him a visiting scholar status, and we're very grateful that he's able to find some time to make some comments, excellent comments on my book. Now, I should spend some time talking about why I wrote this book than what is in the book. I think often I find why a scholar writes a particular book is much more interesting and important than what is in the book, because everybody can read the book. But sometimes the subtext of the book, why it was written, is not stated. And let me state that. And the first reason was what Jürgen said, is the underdog status of Southeast Asia. I actually like to support the underdog in my scholarship. I always like to study and champion regions, and I use the term champion in a way that probably many scholars will not recognize. I actually believe in Southeast Asian agency because it's a group of small countries and small states. So when I first wrote this book, Tony Reed, who is the preeminent historian of Southeast Asia, he actually wrote a blurb about it, and he said the message of the book is actually about not only scholarly message, but it also sort of makes up for the process of Southeast Asia becoming a region. And so this is a book written from heart rather than from my mind per se. Because I wrote this book after spending almost 10 years in Southeast Asia. It is an inductive book. It's not based on any pre-existing suppositions or theories or ideas that I was testing in Southeast Asia. My scholarship, my methodology is much more inductive in that sense. I would like to see the region and meet the people before I write about them, rather than test any theory. So this book was written after I spent about 10 years in the region. I've written other things, but this is what really got me engaged. And the other reason is I was very interested, and I'm still very interested in traveling in the region and particularly following the history of the art history, architecture history of the region. A lot of the region, Southeast Asia, before Islam came in the 15th century, 14th, 15th century, was Hindu-Buddhist. And I grew up in India, and I could identify with, it was fascinating to see major monuments of Hindu-Buddhist monuments in Southeast Asia, which are influenced by India, but are quite like Indian Hindu-Buddhist temples. In fact, the largest Hindu temple in the world is not in India, which is the only really Hindu country in the world aside from Nepal, but it is in Cambodia. The largest Buddhist monument in the world is not in India either, or Nepal. It's actually in Indonesia. And the idea that looking at those monuments and looking at comparing the architecture, comparing the imagery, got me to think, and art and politics are very closely linked. You can go and look at those. It's like doing your field work. You can go look at the reliefs of Borobudur or reliefs of Angkor and many other temples, and you'll get a sense of the politics and history of the region, going back to at least 1,000 years, or 1,500 years. So the fact that ideas can travel and get transformed in a way that they are not quite like what you find them at the point of their origin, but they're modified, localized, gave me my idea of localization, which is what I then applied to my theory of norm diffusion. So Southeast Asia, traveling is really fun to do research where you can actually see all these wonderful monuments and still think about international politics. It's not often that you have that experience. And that got my mind engaged as well, which is one reason why I put a lot of pictures into the book, the second edition of the book. The other thing is that the first edition was criticized. As Jürgen pointed out, it has its supporters, but it also had a lot of detractors. It really created a debate of the kind that we did not really have at least in the study of politics and international relations of Southeast Asia. So some people thought it was a fantastic book. It was actually reviewed in Pacific Affairs as the best book on Southeast Asian region. It was also reviewed by somebody else in another journal called the worst book ever written on Southeast Asia. So I thought there must be something good about a book that gets praised as the best and the worst at the same time. And so I thought, I owe it to my readers to take on some of the criticisms and actually address them. And that's when I started thinking about doing the second edition. And the second edition is actually more than double of the first edition. And it has pictures, 60 pictures, which the first edition did not have. And those photos I thought would be very important given my interest in representing the places and the people of Southeast Asia rather than simply generalizing about them in a very abstract way. A lot of the pictures I took myself. Some of the pictures we bought. It took me about 2 years to collect the pictures and get the copyright sorted out. Writing a book with those kind of pictures is by no means easy. So this is the lesson I learned, and this is the reason why I wrote this book. But the most important reason for writing this book is to really find a bridge between the area studies approach and the sort of disciplinary approach to Southeast Asia, or in this case, international relations discipline approach. So I was trained as a student of international relations. I was not trained as a student of Southeast Asian studies. But my first job, and purely because of an accident, that was in Southeast Asia. And when I went to Southeast Asia, in Singapore in 1987, I had no intention of staying there or no intention of studying Southeast Asia. But after I have spent a year or two, I realized that this is a fantastic opportunity to study a new region. My PhD dissertation was the U.S. Central Command, the origins of the U.S. Central Command. I wrote one of the first books about the U.S. Central Command. And so it was different region, different sort of theme. But when I went there, I thought this is a great region. It's cheap, it's beautiful, it's easy to travel, it's safe. And all these things are very important, by the way. I've been since to Africa, Latin America, other place, Middle East, and Europe. Of course, Europe is great, but it's not cheap. It ain't cheap. Other regions have the problems. Rarely you can find a region where costs are low, facilities are excellent, there's no violence is not lurking, including in my own country like India. I am scared about traveling in India from time to time. I always have people traveling with me, and China is sort of sometimes it's overwhelming for me. But I feel very much at home in Southeast Asia. And that was also, these personal things are very important when you write a book. It's not writing a book, or specializing on something is not just about the intellectual challenge, which is important, but I think many of you students here will realize this, that you have to focus on something that you like and you fall in love with, really. So in that sense, the area studies approach became it came to me later. First it was international relations, looking at things like security, regional security, which was my dissertation about, but the area studies approach came to me once I was there. And a lot of it was actually conceived. A lot of the ideas that went into this book, or my familiarization with Southeast Asia, were actually done not in the classroom, since I never took a course on Southeast Asia, not even in seminars or conferences, but in coffee shops. I had a friend to whom the book is dedicated, and I want to remind you to take a look at this. He died in 2007, the year I left Singapore. Ananda Raja, he's an anthropologist. These are the best people. If you want to do area studies, these are the best people to look at it. Anthropologists know the region. And he and I spent many, countless hours with other people, visitors, in coffee shops, over a tiger beer in Singapore, and many beers, and studying the region and debating, and about culture, politics, history, everything. And again, that's extremely important. if you want to do that kind of area studies. And but my goal was to bridge the gap between international relations and area studies, because those two communities don't speak to each other often. The international relations people think they have theory, they have the disciplinary approach. Areas are basically places to go to test your theories. It's their testing ground. The area studies people can be also very snooty, and they say, hey, if you haven't spent 10 years or 15 years, you haven't done the language, if you have not gone native, then you are not doing area studies. And there are people to this day who would not recognize me as an area specialist. Even the fact that I spent 12 years in the region and I speak one of the languages, but they say, oh, this guy, regional security, theory, norm diffusion, these are not really what our Southeast Asian studies is about. But reluctantly, but in an increasing number, they are coming to accept that, well, there is something to this kind of scholarship that bridges the gap. And you can see that the reviews of the book, some of whom are about the first edition, and there are 3 or 4 reviews come out of the second edition. These are both from area specialists and from international relations scholars. So how do you bridge the gap? Well, I think one of the best ways is to induce, not deduce. Inductive scholarship helps you to do that because you know the region. I mean, if I didn't speak confidently about the people and culture and the governments and the traditions of the region, which you have to, only way to know this is actually be there and observe, then I don't think your theories will be taken seriously. But at the same time, if you don't have a theoretical framework and you are just doing kind of pure area studies, and you are just spending a lot of time in the region, you're not able to conceptualize, you're not able to develop ideas that can be exported and compared with other regions, you're also losing a good part of your potential audience. So this is what I was trying to do, develop something out of Southeast Asia that would give me a comparative framework where other regions can be, in terms of which other regions can be studied. And of course, here I was already in a good situation because by this time, especially in the 2000s, constructivism was becoming popular. And I thought constructivism was a particularly good fit. As long as there was no constructivism, as long as there was realism and liberalism, you could do a lot of Southeast Asian studies. And one of the scholars I have the deepest respect for, a former colleague of Jürgen at LSE, Michael Liefer, he was more in the realist tradition, but he was fantastic. We all were his disciples. And in fact, my other major book, Constructing a Security Community in Southeast Asia, was written under for his series. But I just thought that realism sort of kind of understates the cultural identity aspect. But we have good methodology. We have now good discourses going on about culture, identity, norms. Why can't we bring this? So the timing was actually good for this book in that sense. So I used that opportunity to talk about regions and how regional identity of the regions are formed. Now, let me see if I can find my PowerPoint and give you some idea of what this framework is about. I'm sure it came up and, okay, my computer. Also, I only have 3 slides. I'll show you very quickly and some sense of find this. Okay. So the idea of the second, it wasn't there in the first edition. The second edition, which is really double the size, expanded and revised, thought about developing a theory of regional identity by arguing with the people who critiqued the book, the first edition, and taking advantage of the rise of constructivism and also my own experience of living and working in Southeast Asia. So you all know about Benedict Anderson's famous formulation that regions are imagined communities. Now, Anderson is, in a sense, an inspiration, although I don't agree with him on everything, and I'm sure he would not agree with a lot of what I say. But he was an inspiration for 2 reasons. One is this idea of imagined communities, which I thought if it can be applied to nations, why not to regions? And there is a parallel. There are differences, but there's a parallel between imagining a state, a nation, and also imagining a region. But Anderson also, and many people don't realize, he is a Southeast Asianist. He is an Indonesian specialist, and now he's actually specialized in 3 countries, Philippines, Thailand, and Indonesia. There is a person who could write a theory, who could develop a theory of nationalism that is universally accepted, or at least considered to be one of the most important contributions to the understanding of regionalism. And he did it out of Southeast Asia. So it's an inspiration for me, someone like me, was trying to do the same thing about regionalism and regional security. There goes this idea from the underdog that Southeast Asia doesn't matter. Or as Kenneth Walsh would say, Denmark doesn't matter. Well, I think to me, Denmark matters. And so does Brunei, so does Singapore, so does Myanmar. So the ability to develop the scope and the interest in developing something big out of a region of relatively weak and fragile states is actually quite interesting. And Southeast Asia, as you know, is surrounded by 2 big civilizational neighbors, India and China. Southeast Asia traditionally was known as south of China, east of India. But the fact that these countries could actually make a difference in international relations through regional cooperation, one part of which is identity building, is actually a major story that needed to be written. And that is the story I tried to write, both in the first edition or in the second edition. In the second edition, I do have a framework that actually covers that and spells it out, which I hope and I believe can be applied to any other region, to understand how regions are created, how regions are imagined and socially constructed. So material and ideational, I'll just go through very quickly. Region building, regional identity, regional understanding international relations is not just about geography, GDP, geopolitics, but also about culture, norms, and values. Whole and the parts. This was a very controversial theme in the first edition of the book. A lot of area studies, particularly Southeast Asia, is country by country. So if you have a text, but the first textbooks that were written, and this is why I got a lot of flack from actually a colleague of Jürgens, who is trained in Cornell. And Cornell University, which has the best Southeast Asian Studies department, actually produced a lot of great literature, but they're all about, with one exception, by Walters, whom I used, all about countries. So it will be a book called The Politics of Southeast Asia. So there'll be chapters, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and there's nothing beyond that. Michael Leifer, who was also in LA, she tried to transcend that in the security area by focusing on ASEAN, but he kind of had a more sparse framework in the sense that he did not take into account culture and identity as much as I do, but he was very, very inspirational. But my argument that regionals are more than the sum of their units, that there is more to the jungle than the trees individually considered, is actually very important, that you can get something out of regional dynamics by studying regional dynamics that you cannot get by studying individual countries. Now, this argument was being made at that time by people like Barry Bujan and others at the global level. But in Southeast Asian level, I thought I could actually prove it in a much more direct and clear way. And that remains, despite the fact that there is a lot of differences. Southeast Asia is the most diverse region in the world. You can find there all religions. There's Christianity in Philippines. Philippines is a Catholic majority country. There are 3 Islamic majority countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei. There are at least 2 Buddhist majority countries, Thailand and Cambodia. And there's pockets of Hinduism in Indonesia. And of course there is Cambodia, Cambodia is a Buddhist country as well. Laos and Vietnam actually are technically communist countries, but Confucian and Laos is Buddhist. And Vietnam is Confucian, as well as Buddhist, as well as communist. Now this is very important. All the colonial powers were there. The Dutch ruled Indonesia, the British did Malaya and Singapore and Myanmar. The French were in Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, and of course the Spanish and the Americans were in Philippines. And the Portuguese had actually the first colonial power to go there in Malacca and also East Timor. So all the colonial powers are there. Any number of languages. If you take a material view, and if you take a country-by-country view, you will not get the complexity, the richness of Southeast Asia. How is this region able to develop any sense of regionalism, despite this material diversity, geographic diversity, even cultural, linguistic diversity? Partly because there are underlying elements of a cultural similarity which are obscured because the nation-state model was very superficial and artificially imposed by colonial countries. So you have to look beyond that, for which you need to go into the past. Now, this is why my third sort of element of the framework. Okay. The third element of framework is that you cannot understand Southeast Asia just by looking at the post-1945 period, or even the post-1511 period, when the Portuguese conquered Malacca, the first colonial presence in Asia after Goa. So you have to go back to look at what used to be the region of Southeast Asia in terms of trade, in terms of cultural diffusion, before the European colonialism came about. And that is true of a lot of other regions. You know, many parts of the world, national boundaries are artificially created by colonialism or colonial powers, but it often disrupted the traditional linkages among societies and states from the historical tradition. So Southeast Asia had a lot of intra-regional trade before the Portuguese and the Dutch actually started creating monopolies and making it very difficult to trade with, for these countries to trade with each other. So after colonialism came, the trade was between the colonies and the metropolitan countries, rather than among the countries themselves. Similarly, you will find states of Southeast Asia, pre-colonial states of Southeast Asia, they often covered the contemporary territories of modern nation states. So the Srivijayan Empire covered parts of Indonesia, parts of Malaya, parts of Thailand, and even parts of today's Cambodia. Now today, of course, you cannot think about that. These are 4 nation states. The fact that they were linked together in a pre-colonial political order is important. So you have to really look at the past to make sense of the present, not because you think past is being replicated, which is a criticism of my book. Somehow I thought, you know, the present is the replication of the past. No, to understand this underlying regionality of Southeast Asia, you have to really look beyond the colonial, look before the colonial period. So the past is important, history matters. Then the question of inside and outside. Regions. A lot of people think regions are constructed by outsiders. There is a lot of truth to it. A lot of regions are created by Britain and the United States. For example, the terms like Far East, Middle East, they conform to British wartime, a British military command structure, a geopolitical command structure. Southeast Asia as a name became popular when the Allied powers created the Southeast Asia Command to fight the Japanese and under Lord Louis Mountbatten. The United States created the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. Does it mean that these regional definitions were created by outsiders? Well, it may seem so. There is some people, there's actually one political science specialist in Southeast Asia who said the term Southeast Asia is nothing but the figment of the imagination of American and British political scientists and historians. Well, there is some truth to it. A lot of Americans and British historians and political scientists study Southeast Asia. And often they created this field because they would be distinguished from China and India specialists. It's more difficult to compete with scholars of India and China. There are many of those. But if you create a field to yourself, then you can dominate it. I was in the University of Yangon in December for 3 weeks. That's one of the places where Southeast Asia was invented. D.G.E. Hall, a British historian, was professor in the University of Yangon. When the University of Yangon was the center of Southeast Asian learning. I mean, it's hard to imagine it now, but that was the leading university of Southeast Asia in the 1940s and 50s. But so can we accept that the regions are built from outside? Well, yes, but to me, those are fragile entities, unless there is an internal dynamic and construction of regions from within. And that includes the states, elites, as well as the people. But to me, the point of reference here was the construction of Southeast Asia by ASEAN. So ASEAN was created in 1967. And to give you one example, in 1955, when the historic conference in Bandung was held, you know, anybody who does Global South will know the Bandung Conference. It's the first conference of newly independent countries, Asia and African countries, in Bandung, Indonesia, where the non-aligned movement was, in a sense, born. And there was Sukarno, there was Nasser, there was Chou En-lai, and this inspired the non-aligned movement. You know who sponsored that? The sponsor of this conference was officially called Conference of Southeast Asian Prime Ministers. Very carefully remember, Conference of Southeast Asian Prime Ministers. And you know who were members of that conference? 5 prime ministers. Jawaharlal Nehru, Muhammad Ali of Pakistan, John Kotlawala of Ceylon, and then, of course, Alisa Samajoyo from Indonesia, and Wunu from Burma. So if you look at today's Southeast Asia, the Conference of Southeast Asian Prime Ministers only had 2 countries who are today considered to be part of Southeast Asia. The 3 of them were actually part of what is today called South Asia. The South Asia-Southeast Asia link did not come about. It didn't break until ASEAN was created. And when ASEAN was created in 1967, there's another interesting thing about it. And this tells you how regions are socially constructed and imagined communities. So ASEAN was created in August 67, and they invited, the ASEAN foreign ministers meeting in Bangkok, invited Ceylon, Sri Lanka Ceylon those days. It hasn't become Sri Lanka, to join. Because Sri Lanka has historic ties with Thailand, and Buddhist ties with Thailand, Burma, and the like. They waited, they deferred the conference by 2 days so that Ceylon can send its foreign minister. But the Ceylonese decided no, because for ideological domestic reasons, they thought ASEAN was too close to the United States, or it might be perceived as kind of aligned rather than non-aligned. They didn't come. Okay, 10 years later, same country, now called Sri Lanka, applies for membership in ASEAN and was rejected. Why? They were not a Southeast Asian country. So within 10 years, they delayed the conference by 2 days, the signing of the ASEAN Declaration by 2 days, so that Sri Lanka can come, Ceylon can come. 10 years later, they rejected the application by same country because it's not a Southeast Asian country. Now, a lot of things have happened in between, the US withdrawal from Indochina and also ASEAN's early years. And this is where the idea of social construction, that regions are not a given, they are socially constructed. You cannot find a better example than this. So therefore, inside construction, and I really don't think without ASEAN there will be an entity called Southeast Asia. The relationship between ASEAN and Southeast Asia has become quite symbiotic, which is why the future of Southeast Asia as a region to some extent depends on whether ASEAN survives and continues to play a central role or not. And we in American University at SIS decided to create the first ASEAN center in this country, and one of the very few in the world, because we thought, just like the European Union sums up, it's not entire Europe, but it's hard to understand Europe without the European Union. Similarly, so there are a lot of European Union centers in the world today, of course funded by Brussels. In our case, we had to raise our own money with some help from SIS, but we thought it would be good to have an ASEAN center, just like there are so many Southeast Asia centers in the country. In the United States, there are about a dozen Southeast Asian centers, but no ASEAN center. So finally, permanence and transience. And I said just earlier, just now, that Southeast Asia was invented. It's a constructed entity. There's nothing natural given about it. It was constructed through interactions, through a very clever and far-sighted attempt by the elite of the region to reconcile nationalism with regionalism. But can it last, given that we have so many new developments in the region? And one development that really challenges Southeast Asian identity is the resurrection of Chinese and Indian power. Now remember, ASEAN was created in 1967. That's a time when China and India were down and out. China went through cultural revolution, was going through, and very much in internal turmoil. India and China had fought a war in 62. India had fought a war with Pakistan in 65. And 2 years later, ASEAN is formed. So India and China were the natural leaders of Southeast Asia. Historically, they're the most powerful civilizations affecting Southeast Asian history, culture, and politics. But they were down and out in 67. It left the door open for ASEAN countries to make their own stamp, put their own mark in building regionalism. But today, China is back, and India is back, and they are rising very fast. And Southeast Asia is right in the confluence of China-India interactions. So how can Southeast Asian countries, which are not small in size or population, but in terms of power, and has sort of a certain amount of fragility that exceeds those of India and China, how can these countries maintain their autonomy in the face of these two rising civilizational and political and economic powers? So there is this question about Southeast Asian, whether Southeast Asia will last. As Don Emerson, a very distinguished Southeast Asian historian said, or political scientist said, that nations come and go, why not regions? A lot of nations have disappeared over the course of history. I mean, in Southeast Asia. One region that disappeared is Champa, only in the 17th century, southern part of Vietnam, just simply disappeared from the face of the earth, but became part of Vietnam. The white under ASEAN. So we cannot take this identity and the idea of a region of Southeast Asia for granted. But at the same time, nobody would have predicted that Southeast Asia would have come this far, and ASEAN would have come this far when it was created in 1967. Most Americans dismissed it. The British gave it qualified understanding, acceptance, but most of the Westerners thought this ASEAN experiment is going to fail and it's going to disappear. So the fact that it has survived, and also today it's the only regional organization that collects, that gets all the major powers and the leaders of the international system. Every year, the leaders of all the major powers of the international system today, including America, Japan, China, European Union, and European Union goes only to the ARF, not at the leaders level, but through the ASEAN Asia-Europe meeting. Australia, Canada, Russia, they all come to Southeast Asia to meet the Southeast Asian leaders. They don't get Southeast Asians to come to their territory. They go there. When Obama was reelected, his first overseas trip was to Bangkok, Yangon, and to Cambodia. Can you imagine the most powerful leader of the world going to a country called Cambodia on his first, instead of going to Canada, by the way? That's where the American presidents usually go, the first trip. So this is remarkable that these countries have not only achieved through unity something that was unbelievable when it was formed 45 years ago. And I don't think they would have just done it through material means, because they don't have really a lot of economic military power. It's basically by regionalism and this identity building, although it's not everything, but it's definitely a part of it. And that is the central message of the book. And I would invite you to read this. One of the things that you'll find that there is a lot of pictures there. And the pictures actually took a long time for me to collect, as I said, but that will give you, keep your interest engaged. And as I said, the criticisms of the book, you can hint at a couple of them. I'm accused of overstating regional identity and overstating agency. This is the second criticism is the most important one. How could this bunch of countries really matter in international politics? Well, again, to get the answer, I take this criticism very seriously, but I have my answer in the book, but it's also have been reviewed. The first edition was reviewed both positively and negatively, but luckily the positive reviews exceeded the negative ones, so it encouraged me to do the second edition. The 3 reviews I've seen so far of the second edition have been really, really great. So this is one in Perspectives and Politics, and this is one in Pacific Affairs, which compares the book with John Fairbanks' United States and China, but also says that the debates that the book will engender promise to be fierce and constructive. So I'm looking forward to the fierce debate, and also by a very important Southeast Asian classic sort of area specialist called Robert Taylor recently wrote a review, said that as an introduction to the region, there is no better written or more comprehensive volume available. To me, the last part is last comment is the most important one. It's the dream of every writer, every academic, to write a book that is considered the best introduction to a particular region or particular theme. Now, to me, that particular sentence means a lot. That after spending so long in the region, spending so much time in the region, I actually get the recognition from an area specialist. This is a classic area specialist who also criticizes me before he says this thing. But it's very gratifying that you come to this point. I look forward to a lot of other criticisms, and when you write a book, that's only part of the story. The rest of your life spend defending your approach, and that's going to happen with this book as well. Thank you very much.
That would be fine. Okay, thank you for having me here to make some closing remarks. I'm pleased to add my congratulations to this very valuable contribution to the understanding of ASEAN's role, in Southeast Asia's emergence on the global scene. And I'd like to thank Dr. Juergen Hake for his very thoughtful and masterly review of the major themes in Amitav's book. Now, I think, I don't know how I taught my classes in Southeast Asia without, the books that Amitav is writing. And I look forward to more books and also to your forthcoming publications, as well, Dr. Jürgen. So, but basically, I think that from, Amitav has made this outstanding contribution to bridging the divide from the viewpoint of the ASEAN Studies Center. Is a divide between scholarship and policy-related understanding of ASEAN and contemporary events in Southeast Asia. But he's highlighted the region's deeply embedded cultural practices that have shaped the distinctive practices of ASEAN, which has over these past decades confounded its critics, but proven to be a remarkably successful institution and one that's recognized by the US today and all the major powers as a key driver of integration in the region. Now, Amitav, as you know, is the chair of the ASEAN Studies Center, and under his leadership, we have pursued an ambitious agenda in the brief period of 4 years since we were formed. Many symposiums, workshops, seminars, gatherings, such as this one, we combine coursework, student and faculty research, exchange and internship opportunities, and all of that have one common purpose. And the purpose is to bring together international and US-based scholars, NGO activists, business community leaders, policymakers, diplomats, and students and researchers concerned with ASEAN and Southeast Asia to promote theoretically grounded, historically informed, policy-relevant scholarship to enhance cross-cultural sensitivity and awareness and greater capacity for addressing the many issues on the ASEAN and the US-ASEAN relations agenda. And like you, Amitav, before, it was only the last, I think, 5 or 6 years that books that have unifying themes that bring Southeast Asia, they look at Southeast Asia from the disciplines of international relations or international political economy, people that, scholars like Beeson and others, coming in, and Slater, the younger scholars are now looking at Southeast Asia, looking at these theoretical themes. But before that, we were all siloed in the country-specific, studies. So it's only in the last 5 years of the long period I've been teaching Southeast Asia that I've now we have this rich scholarship with the theoretical insights that we didn't have before. And this has made Southeast Asia so much more challenging, so much more exciting and stimulating to teach. And now we can talk to the other regions, we can talk to the scholars using the same language, but doing it in our own terms and making them look at Southeast Asia on their own terms. And for that, Amitav, I thank you for scholarship. This is the,
So we have time for questions, yeah?
Here is the question there. You can ask to either of us
Oh, no, this
or
is,
make a comment.
okay.
generally.
Kind of question, comment. I was interested in your application of Benedict Anderson, because my reading of Anderson is that he was really not a fan of nationalism, that what inspired his book was his frustration that there wasn't a class identity, but that national identities were much more capable of mobilizing people to the point of people being willing to kill and die for people they did not know at all. And I'm wondering whether he would also embrace a regional identity given his hatred of the Indonesian regime that toppled Sukarno and prevented him from going back to Indonesia all of those years, and that is celebrated by the current Indonesian government. These are really a mix of countries with very different politics, and I don't really read him as a constructivist. I read him as somebody who's thinking there are these objective realities of conflict, and then there's this constructed identity.
That's a really great question, and thanks really for asking me that. I have thought about this, and in fact, even after writing this second edition, and recently I had to speak on this subject, and it got me to think even more. Now, first of all, I am also not a fan of nationalism, so we have something in common. But I always felt Anderson is conflicted. He is somebody who went to Indonesia. He loved the Indonesia before Suharto. He did not like Indonesia after Suharto. He kept waited until the Suharto regime will fall, and then when he fell, he went back. And then some people said, not him himself, that he was right, the Swat regime is going to fall, except that it took 30 years. So I think he was passionate about radical nationalism. He actually, in his writing, you'll see there are different types of nationalism. Nationalism like Sukarno, like Myanmar, Aung San, that's great. What nationalism like Singapore or Malaysia, where you don't really don't have the radical passion, it was not appealing to him. The second thing about Anderson, you are absolutely right that constructivism appropriated him. He was not a constructivist. A lot of his, the way nation states are constructed, he looked at very material things, communication, print media, bureaucracy, civil service, language, schools. And those are, while language is both material and ideational, but he was not talking purely on ideational sort of linkages. But that doesn't prevent theorists to sort of look at this. But the fact that he talked about imagination, that term, if he hadn't used imagined community, he would not be used by constructivists. Because imagining something is more than material. I mean, that's where intersubjectivity comes in. So he lent himself, willingly or unwillingly, wittingly or unwittingly, to constructivist appropriation. And I actually never had a chance to talk to him except on the margins of one conference. It's very hard to get, and I'm kind of very shy. He actually lives in Thailand now. But it is very hard to get a sense of where he stands on this question of constructivism, constructivists actually appropriating his work. But we think he did a service by setting the scene, an agenda for how culturally divergent groups can actually come together through interactions and through some also linkages like the bureaucracy and the like. But why can't you apply to the region? There is a big difference between Anderson and my approach. And this is simply that after all, colonialism was an external force. And it was a very limited force. I mean, you look at the history of Southeast Asia. Well, 400 years are dominated by colonial powers. But Southeast Asia history going back to at least 2,000 years, if not more. So can you make a generalization about a region based on a 400-year history or a 2,000-year history? This is also a matter of debate among Southeast Asian historians and scholars. So nationalism was created because of the 400 years of colonialism. Now, people like me think the idea of regionalism goes beyond those 400 years. There was regional connections and interactions before that and after the colonial period. And it was Anderson's colleague, O.W. Walters, who wrote really the first inspirational book on Southeast Asia's regional identity. He wrote it as a historian, but I was very inspired by it. In fact, he is the source of my localization theory. And he talked about historical patterns of interstate relations, which pre-existed colonialism and still continues to inform Southeast Asia. And another person who you would know, James Scott, who writes on resistance, his idea is this whole idea of nation state, colonial imposed nation state, has come and is going. Southeast Asia will go back to different forms of statehood. And although he is pessimistic about what that might be, it may not be stability, it may be instability, but there's something to be said about it, not recognizing what is a remarkably brief interlude of Western colonialism in a region that has a much longer history. So if you take the longue durée approach of Brodel, we might come up with very different ideas about nationalism and regionalism. And my sort of difference with Anderson is that I would put much more emphasis on indigenous agency rather than the colonial agency or the civil service and the like, which is why you can find that a country like Indonesia today, people think it's very fragile. True, it is very fragile. It was basically created by the Dutch. It was an imagined community. But it's more than that today because of institutions and interactions that have happened since the Dutch left. And maybe we should look at Indonesia more than just, and the whole idea of imagined community is becoming passé. I mean, when I actually gave a speech on this book in Bangkok, I was criticized by a Thai scholar. He said, regions are no longer imagined communities. In ASEAN is no longer an imagined community. It's a real thing out there. So actually, I thought, yeah, you may be right. It's good to start with this idea of, that's how ASEAN came about, as an imagined community, but it's not imagined anymore. there's a lot more reality to it. So both Anderson and myself may be out of date, in the future. But at least the difference is, I would say, is the local factors, local history, local circumstances, the local agency, far more important than just the colonialism to me was divisive. It undermined the region. The history, pre-colonial history, and the post-colonial history kept the region, brought back the region.
Let's have a conversation
Sure.
afterwards, because
Sure. Yeah.
Hi, it was very interesting. I came in late, but the remainder that I caught was actually very enlightening, and I appreciated that. I just had a question about, I don't know if this was discussed before I came here, but the issue of Thailand. Is there parallels to what's going on in Thailand to Ukraine? Or is it the reverse of what's going on in Ukraine?
I'm not a Ukraine specialist. I can talk about Thailand endlessly. I actually was there just on my way back from Indonesia. I spent a couple of days there, and I spent a week in December there. I don't know whether Ukraine, to understand Thailand, you have to understand not just politics, but also the politics of class. It's a real class divide. So the elite of Bangkok, who are in cahoots with the military and believe in the monarchy, they basically don't like democracy. Because democracy takes, they're rich people, and democracy means power going to the poor people. The poor people are the Northeast people, who are a majority. So the electoral system is so skewed that if there is a free and fair election, the rural voters will re-elect the Thaksin or his family, because they get a lot of benefits from that Thaksin regime, even though that regime is very corrupt. Both sides are corrupt, by the way, but one is a little more than others. So the people of the rural areas are willing to accept a democratically elected, slightly more corrupt regime, and they think they are being sidelined and being treated in a very condescending way by the elite of Bangkok, which is in cahoots, is in a kind of a partnership with the military and the monarchy. So this is really a class divide, and it's really very hard to bridge unless you have some good sense prevails on those leaders. It's a pretty scary time for Thailand, and the king, who has been a unifying force, is in bad health and also as a declining political force. I really don't know enough about Ukraine, whether it has this military bureaucratic military monarchy. I don't know even Thailand has a monarchy. Ukraine has a monarchy. Okay, so it will be quite different in that sense. Yeah, sorry.
Hi. So I actually have a question that speaks more to Southeast Asia as the underdog, as you referred to. In the most recent publication of Foreign Affairs, they referred to the Fragile Five of, I guess, instead of the BRICS now, Brazil, India, Indonesia, Turkey, and South Africa are sort of seen as more fragile and perhaps riskier investments. And it makes me wonder, speaking to the field itself and the new focus on Southeast Asia, how fragile is that from our perspective to, I guess, the whims of, or the winds of economics, and with the change in the rebalance after Secretary Clinton left, whether or not we're going to continue focusing on that as much. How fragile would you say our focus from the United States is on Southeast Asia if it stops becoming a place we want to invest in, or perhaps just not some place that's as important to us?
That question, answer the question on Thailand, and you may know something more about Ukraine, and I will then make some comment. Would you like to address?
Okay. Before I answer, then I'll just try and come back. I mean, I'm not a Ukraine specialist either, but it seems to me that there's a sort of geopolitical issue there which you don't find in Thailand, because part of the Ukraine is obviously leaning more towards Russia, whereas the other part is sort of more interested in actually joining Europe. So it's a question a little bit as to how to navigate that particular course. And I think some of the unrest you've seen is attributable, at least to some extent, to the decision by the then president, to side with the Russian argument, and there were all sorts of stories about whether or not there were sort of underhand sort of incentives given and all that. Anyway, I'm not a Ukraine specialist, but I think that's an important distinction in terms of the geopolitical setting in which the Ukraine finds itself and how that plays out in the domestic politics as opposed to what is happening in Thailand. The question about the focus, fragility in terms of U.S. policy towards Southeast Asia, I think it's during the Bush years, that's George W. Those years, obviously there was at times this feeling in Southeast Asia that the United States was neglecting the region, and I think that is a little bit unfair perhaps because there were some initiatives undertaken even during those years, but when Obama won came about, there was a much more sustained focus obviously, and this sustained focus sort of had a number of dimensions which are very important but can only really be appreciated if you know a little bit about Southeast Asia as a region. So one of the things that Hillary Clinton tried to do almost immediately was to move beyond the long-standing policy of not actually signing up to the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, which sets out the code of conduct, if you like, in terms of interstate relations within the region and between Southeast Asian states and others. And she also sort of put much more emphasis, I think, on repairing the relationship with ASEAN, at a sort of institutional, multilateral level. And a third dimension, which I'm working on, has to do actually with the revamping of U.S. policy towards Burma, or Myanmar. And in partly that's also connected actually to the idea that once you move beyond the sort of stalemate and ineffectiveness of policy which existed at the time, you can do your bit, or a little bit more even, to repair the ASEAN dimension. So I think that has been accompanied by a range of decisions and measures to do with the revitalization of existing alliances. The alliances with the Philippines and with Thailand, although with Thailand it's a little dodgy. And existing also partnerships. So you will actually see that whether it be the military, whether it be the diplomatic, political, or the economic dimension, the United States has put a lot of focus on Southeast Asia under Obama 1. And you will also see that in economic terms in relation to some of the countries, being interested in the TPP, which is one of those elements, or in the economic side of the pivot, which is being emphasized at the moment still, although we don't quite know as to whether the TPP will actually be agreed, or if so, when it will be ratified. So that is that. Whether that can be sustained, I think to some extent it will be sustained. There are all sorts of commitments being made, at least in declaratory form, when it comes to as to how the military positions itself and as to what is being done, to give America more of access, to the region in strategic terms than would have been available before, and that again links also to Australia and other things. But so I don't know whether the administration now, which is obviously again focusing very much on the Middle East, is going to put exactly the same amount of time into dealing with Southeast Asia. I think there are a number of people in Southeast Asia who are already getting worried again, that under Obama 1 was more or less just a phase. But I think the jury is still out there, and it would be premature for me to come up with a rounded final conclusion on that.
If I add something to it, first of all, I am deeply skeptical of any formulations like BRICS or Fragile Five. These are sound bites that are meant to attract attention. And I don't know, you said an article in Foreign Affairs, I haven't read. And last time I published an article with them, they titled it as Overturning the Legacy of Lee Kuan Yew, which means I am kind of persona non grata in parts of Singapore still. And I actually thought Singapore's Democratic Dreams. That was my title. And these are journals, magazines who live and die by sound bites. And I really increasingly have less respect for them. And also, you should remember that there are also alternative views. McKinsey just came out with a report that Indonesia will be the number 7 economy, seventh largest economy in the world, which also gives me to the point that there are also good news from Southeast Asia. Indonesia is good news. People would have thought Indonesia will disintegrate. There is an article, there is a Delphi paper by Tim Huxley with the title, it's a question of how soon Indonesia can disintegrate.
Although he found it wouldn't. He defined it would.
And then Burma, who would have thought 4 or 5 years ago, 3 years ago, that Burma will come to the stage it is. So you can, the Philippines is actually doing reasonably well economically. So these things can come and go. I would not really think, I would not use the term fragile 5 to Southeast Asia. And also it would be very careful using any such term to India, because India has a resilience which is pretty hard for most Westerners to actually understand how this country survives, but it has that resilience. And so take this, don't take this on face value, but try to find out alternative views, and then you can make a decision. And a lot of these sound bites are actually meant for investors. Investors, yes, come and go. But look, people thought Southeast Asia fell apart in 1997, but it did a pretty good job in 2008 in the global economic crisis. So that tells you something, that these countries are going to learn, they're going to actually do their best, and they're not just to be dismissed with sound bites like Fragile 5. Can't talk about Brazil, but I think Brazil has a great future. I was there 2-3 months ago. I cannot imagine a country not having a great future.
Hi, Professor. My name is Acharya. I'm an undergrad student here at SIS. I'm personally from Cambodia, from the region area. I'm really interested in study about Southeast Asia. But the one thing that I have in concern, because I know so much about the area, is that how realistic can Southeast Asia will become the ASEAN community, due to the problem that each country have internal conflicts, with regional conflict between country to country, and at the same time, the rising power, such as China, the emerging economics development into Southeast Asia, and the problem of South China Sea, and those are the big problem. And then I just feel confused, how would it be realistic that Southeast Asia will become the ASEAN community?
Well, very quickly, these are not, some of these problems are not new. Southeast Asia has always had internal conflicts and interstate conflicts. So, also it's relative. I mean, relative to, say, South Asia, relative to Northeast Asia, relative to the Middle East. Actually, you can find that there are some pretty good signposts in Southeast Asia, good reasons to be optimistic. You talk about interstate conflict. There is a serious issue in South China Sea, and it is not between the Southeast Asian countries, between Southeast and China. But look, the conflict between Cambodia and Thailand, I mean, just in the larger scheme of things, what's the big deal? That kind of a conflict. Compare that to China, Taiwan, North and South Korea, India, Pakistan. This is really not, again, in the relative scope of things. And Southeast Asian countries do have a tradition of resolving their conflicts peacefully, either through ASEAN or through the International Court of Justice. So Singapore, Malaysia took the case to the International Court of Justice, so did Malaysia, Indonesia, so did Thailand and Cambodia. I guess the Thai-Cambodia settlement is not a perfect one. It might come back once the situation in Thailand becomes sort of clearer. But still, these are countries which are willing to take their disputes to the International Court of Justice for judicial arbitration. India and Pakistan don't do that. China and its neighbors don't do that. So there is, therefore, to me, that hope when it comes to interstate conflicts. The only thing I worry about is the rise of China and India relative to the region. But if we have Fragile 5 and India is one of them, so I think Southeast Asia will be okay. And I think China is a real worry. But we have to wait and see how far China can go. But China has a lot to lose too. If it tries to be a real hegemon, there is one simple geopolitical fact here. China, more than 60% of China's foreign trade comes from overseas trade. A lot of that goes to the Indian Ocean. If China closed down the South China Sea, what is the trade going to go? To the Indian Ocean. This where China is not a superpower. It's United States, India, and also some of the ASEAN countries are quite important. Normatively, if China is seen as a bully and a hegemon to its own neighbors, what kind of respect it will command in the international community? So, and I think the Chinese are aware of that. I go to China quite often, and there is a danger of things going out of control, but there is also a lot of realization how not to push things too far.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for staying till to the end, but not quite because we have food, and which is why I wanted to wrap up. This has been one of the most interesting intellectual engagements I have had at SIS in 17 years. I learned so much, and I'm confident that you all share this. Would you join me in giving both of our speakers a big round of applause? I will reserve my question for our speakers afterwards, because to me, if you talk about imagined communities, you also talk about J.S. Furnivall and pluralism. It actually was developed before polyarchy, developed by Robert Dahl. And I would really like to hear how this pluralism is reconciled and how it comes together in terms of nationalism and imagined communities. But we'll talk about that. No event like this is possible without the hard work and dedication of a lot of people. I want to single out two of them. Of course, Aurora now from CRS.